Computer. Hi, Eugene. How are you?
Hi, Jana, I'm good. Yeah, how are you?
I'm great. I'm great. We're already at part three. So here we
Yep.
are with part three. We did part one and part two of the queering of Irish education, and we got great feedback for part one and part two. And we really have just sort of hit the tip of the iceberg, and now we're back to do part three. And before we go into part three, I think it would be really good just for people who may not have seen part one and two, if you just take a minute to talk about what was in part one and what was in part two, and then we can see what feedback has come through from our followers.
Yeah, absolutely. So for part one, was kind of to give us a bit of a foundation because we were going to refer to it in the later episodes where we looked at gender identity, the history behind that, and queer theory, to kind of again understand that and understand the different elements of that and how that would relate to what you would then see in the school, for example. So that was part one. In part two, we looked at the WHO sexuality guidelines, their standards for sexuality, and we looked at the history as well of comprehensive sexuality, which a lot of people probably wouldn't be familiar with. They wouldn't know where it came from and who were the people who were involved in it originally. But some people would have some visibility to the WHO guidelines, maybe not a lot. So we talked about those.
Mhm.
And then for today, we're basically going to continue that. We're going to talk about the UNESCO guidelines, which are kind of complementary to the WHO ones. And then we're going to do an overall summary of those two, a kind of a critique of the two sets of guidelines. And, just to remind people why they're important, the reason those guidelines are important is because they are referred to by the HSE or by the Department of Education or NCCA in relation to sexuality education or anything related to that in terms of well-being, the wellbeing.ie site, etc., the Busybodies Guide. Any queries about regard the people have put in regard to those, they tend to get a reference back to the UNESCO and WHO standards. So that's why they're important because they
Okay.
impact exactly what gets exposed to our children and in schools, etc.
That's great. I think it's really good to show people that these aren't just global entities that aren't coming into Ireland. These aren't just, far away, international bodies. These ones are influencing Irish education. And if we look around in Ireland, most of the things going wrong, be it with the education curriculum or so many other things, most of it does not have an origin in Ireland. It's actually coming from very far offshore. So this series that we're doing will help people close that loop to see where exactly is it coming from. And before I go into kind of reviewing the feedback, I should have, for people who didn't see part one and part two, take a moment to introduce you, Eugene, because on a few comments, people are saying, who is this Eugene? He seems to know so much. So for those who didn't see part one and two, Eugene is a retired engineer. And I think from all the support he's given to the different groups that we work with. I'm the founder of the Natural Women's Council. We work with the Irish Education Alliance, which is a group of teachers and principals, Lawyers for Justice Ireland, and Parents' Rights Alliance. And Eugene does really a lot of the research for our different groups. And you can clearly tell, Eugene, that you're an engineer because I think you have a very unique skill of you've read, hundreds of hours of reading, dozens of books, videos, articles, so much research, and you're able to sort of package it all up and put it in a, condensed. And when I say condensed, the last two sessions were an hour and a half each, but that was condensed compared to the hundreds of hours of research you've done. So you've got the real engineer head to take all this detail and then say, okay, how do I put it into an easy to understand format for the public? So for all the people who asked, that's who Eugene is, expert researcher for all of us. So we are so grateful for that because to read all of that stuff is pretty heavy. I'm going to do a shared screen and let's just see what feedback has come in over the last while since we did that. Can you see that screen there? Is that coming up okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, great. So, so this is just the part one. So the part one, the queering of Irish education, part one that Eugene talked about, an intro to gender identity and queer theory. So I've just sorted comments by the newest comments. I haven't seen this one yet. Oh, 2 days ago. Absolutely amazing presentation here. Clearly, Eugene, you have done a deep dive into this topic and your presentation is factual and clear and blows the lid off of the attempt to hide a dangerous and destabilizing agenda targeting our children behind words like kindness, inclusivity, diversity, etc. Thanks to both. That's great feedback. This two-part series of videos should have at least a couple of million views. It is that important. It lays bare the very sinister agenda beneath the facade of tolerance and inclusivity. So that's great. So these first kind of two recent comments that came in, it's really good that the message that was sent was, it's a very sinister agenda, but it's hiding behind those words that they have clearly hijacked. As these two followers said, the kindness, tolerance, inclusivity. We hear a lot in schools. This has to be rolled out in schools because of anti-bullying. And, you know, all the Irish kids obviously bully each other, so we have to teach them the ideology. So that's great feedback here. There we go. Thank you so much. Great. So yeah, really good feedback. There's 68 comments, but the last two recent ones really summed it up. That's great. Fantastic feedback here. So excellent. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to stop sharing. That was great to see that feedback. I'm going to hand it over to you, Eugene. I know you have some fantastic visuals as well to walk through. So I hand it over to you to share the screen and walk through the part 3 here. You should be host now. There we go. And while you're pulling that up, Eugene, something that just to let the listeners tonight know is that we are building a website. We have a website underway. It's nearly done, and we're going to start housing a lot of the resources. People have asked where we can find the resources in kind of a one-stop shop. But what we're also going to do is, I know, Eugene, you've been traveling all over the length of Ireland and the width of Ireland to present on this. Is we've had people ask for the information to do their own presentations in their own towns and counties. So we will end up building a hub. It will be launched in April, building a hub on our website where people can download this info with all the speaker notes and actually go and host a meeting in their own area to make sure that parents in their own area are aware. So that will be another great initiative. So there we go.
Okay. All right, so we're going to, this part 2, as I said, covering the sexuality guidelines, or comprehensive sexuality education is kind of the broad theme. There will be some sexual references in this. We're not going to have one of the images we had in the previous one, so I don't think you're going to run into anything too egregious here. Some of the terminology might be maybe for more adult themed, if I put it that way, but I don't think it's too bad. This one isn't probably as bad as the previous one, which did have a number of items in it. So we're going to be looking at this document. It's a 2018 document from UNESCO, the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, and there's a link to it there. We'll also have that link in the description. So that's the picture of the front of the document. That's what we're going to be looking at.
If you just go on the document, that little rainbow wheel, do you want to just go back one slide? Yeah. So that little rainbow wheel on the top left, that is the Sustainable Development Goal wheel. I can't read the fine print. Sustainable something there, development. Yeah. So that is linked to the United Nations World Economic Forum, and it's all about the pushing the Agenda 2030. And the Agenda 2030 is based on those sustainable development goals. So a couple of years ago, the WEF and sustainable development goals and Agenda 2030 would have been a conspiracy, but now it's on every document that we see, that little rainbow wheel. And if you stroll through your local parks, you may actually see the sustainable development goals planted right next to the bee pollination garden because it's so sustainable. But the devil's in the detail, and that's what we'll go through tonight.
Yep. So let's move on. So the reasons for these guidelines. So they did have an original document, an earlier one, and they have some revised evidence, I guess. We'll talk about that in a minute from a research perspective. And there was a study done, and we'll take a quick look at that. And then they wanted to, basically update this. They got this group called Advocates for Youth. We'll talk about them in a minute as well. And they had this advisory group, and again, we'll take a look at the advisory group. Now, the difference between the WHO guidelines and the UNESCO ones is that these are international. These are not just for Europe. And that's important, and we'll talk about that a bit more. So this is the reference document, and again, this is the research that was conducted. So this is the updated research that they refer to. This is the document. We'll have a link to it in the description. You can take a look at it. It goes through. It's a kind of a meta-analysis, which means you're taking a look at a whole range of other studies and kind of pulling them together. And I guess the kind of issue when I looked at this is really the coverage from a 5 to 8 year old perspective is extremely weak. There's only a very small number of studies that claim to cover that age group. and and they're but they're like a 5 to 19 kind of age group. And these are the kind of outcomes that they were looking for. And if you look at these outcomes and you look at them from the perspective of a child from 5 to 8 years of age, they're really not that applicable. Most of them aren't applicable at all. There's like maybe one or two you could say you might want to maybe have something. So really the applicability of the research to this age group, it just doesn't seem to be there. I don't think the evidence base is there for it. And I think when we get back to the conclusion at the end, I think one of the points I'll be making is basically, I don't think the 5 to 8 age group should be included. Now, the WHO guidelines actually had a 0 to 4 age group included. So that was even worse from that perspective. But and this is a more recent document. So I don't think there was any evidence at all for them doing that in the WHO document. We'll
Yeah.
come back to that in the summary.
And the WHO
So
document that says one, Eugene, every parent,
Mhm.
when we do our next campaign, every single parent should just, if they look at one document, look at WHO standards of sexuality. We covered it in depth for part 2. That's the document that talks about teaching age
Yeah.
4 masturbation and teaching age 9 about their first sexual experience. So that's an eye opener. If everyone can go back and watch part 1 and 2, you'll catch that detail.
Yeah. And as I say, we will cover the
Brilliant.
critique of that later in this video. So advocates for youth. So who are advocates for youth? So advocates for youth are an aggressive activist group, LGBTQ activist group, and they've been involved in sexuality education in the US. And you can see this case here where they were talking to kids in a school, in grade school. So these are children that may be 10 or 11 years of age, about mutual masturbation. Um, so what was that happening in that school? So there was a bit of an outrage. They got kicked out of the school. The parents weren't happy with this. And, they had also been saying in the last point there, teaching that the parents and the faith leaders in the community, they were biased in their sexual information. So they're kind of putting the children in the school against their parents and against their faith leaders. So Advocates for Youth did this critique. It's a tabletop review of the document. It doesn't really add an awful lot because these people, Advocates for Youth, as I said, are a lobbying activist organization. So the input they're going to give is what they want to give from their activist perspective, which I understand, and I think everybody can understand that. So they're not really adding to the document in any way. Why they were asked and why was nobody else asked to review the document, I don't know. Maybe there's some relationships there. So I don't think their contribution is in any way significant. So in terms of adding any more gravitas to the document, these are the people involved who were not members of UNESCO. These are the people, non-members of UNESCO, who were involved in producing the document. Now, the difference in this one versus the WHO document is we don't have the same influence from Planned Parenthood or International Planned Parenthood. Yes, there is a representative, second person on the list there, who's from International Planned Parenthood on this committee, but you don't have all the people from member associations that you had on the WHO document. So it would not have had the same influence on this document. So keep that point in mind. So that influence, and we'll talk about it again later on, is not here. So there's a lot of people here from different countries, from departments of education. There's people talking about AIDS, etc. And that's down to the international nature of this document. It's more of a global document, not confined to Europe. And that does have a bearing on the content as well, as we'll kind of see. So it brings in additional elements that we didn't have in the WHO document. Things, gender-based violence, which would be more prevalent, for example, in some of the developing countries. If HIV and AIDS, the whole issue of female genital mutilation. So these are things that were not in the European because they wouldn't really be applicable in normally. So that's on the left-hand side. And then the right-hand side, you've got a lot of the new technology. So the WHO guidelines were developed in 2010. That's when they were released. So in 10 years since, we've got cyberbullying, sexting, etc. All of these new things that are kind of much more prevalent today. You could put TikTok on the list, for example. So this is, these are new things that weren't factored into the original WHO guidelines, but they are factored in here.
Interesting,
And there's
Eugene.
nothing
I
wrong with,
see
yeah.
I always find this so interesting and sort of hypocritical that they're talking about female genital mutilation in such a negative way, yet they're pushing transgender ideology, which is leading young girls to mutilate their genitals and remove breasts. So how hypocritical is that, isn't it?
I know we'll probably talk about that a little bit later on when we get to that point in the document. So these are the sections of the document. It's broken out into these 8 different sections. And we're going to take a walk through these. Now, we're going to go through them pretty quick because there's a lot in the document. And if people want to skip ahead and don't want to go through all the detail, then you can do the links on YouTube just to skip forward if you want to get into the summary. But if you want to go through it with us, that's what we're going to go through in the next over the next 15, 20 minutes or so. We're going to spend going through those different sections of the document. And so we'll talk about these, and they're split between different age groups. So you're going to have an age group from 5 to 10, or from 5 to 8, I should say, and then from 9 to 12. And that's the first section that we'll look at. And then you'll go from 12 to 15 and from 15 to 18 plus. The two kind of categories we're going to look at from an age group perspective as we walk through the document. So they're grouped kind of differently than the WHO document. I actually preferred the format of the WHO document. It's a bit easier to follow because everything for the one age group was in the one place. So, in the 2 pages, you got everything for the 0 to 4-year-olds. You might have liked what was on it, but it was all there in the one place. This document, you kind of jump across each of these themes and then across each of the age groups. So it's kind of a little bit harder to navigate, but we'll get into it. So you can see the different ones there. We're going to walk through each of these now as we get into it. So the matrix. So effectively, this is, and we're going to look at the young age groups first. And I guess the kind of the main point I think I'd make on this, and apologies, it's a bit of this is a bit of an eye test. I think the 5 to 8 age group in general, the themes that are in this document for 5 to 8 years of age. Now, some of them might be applicable in some international situations, and I can accept that because, from Europe is different from Africa, from Asia, and there may be things that are applicable elsewhere that are not applicable to Europe. But in general, I don't think the 5 to 8 category makes sense. It just, even if it's not an overly sexual item, it's an item that's just a little bit much for a younger person in that age group. That's kind of the general thoughts. And I welcome your input on it, Jana, from a mother's perspective in terms of, they're just bringing in themes which are just a bit too much for like a 5, 6-year-old, 7-year-old.
Yeah, I have a 5-year-old and I have an 8-year-old, so I'll be able to kind of look at it from the
Yeah,
hat of a mom with that age group. But from what I'm looking on here, this vocabulary and even bringing this into their world would be information they're
yeah,
not mature enough to handle. I mean, they still age 5 and 8, they still believe in Santa Claus. They still believe we had just
yeah,
had
yeah.
Easter Bunny last week. They're living a fantasy world at that age, and this just wouldn't resonate in their young innocent minds. It wouldn't they wouldn't be able to kind of take it on. I think it's a bit too advanced from what I see on this page. And Eugene, just remind us the title of the document. So if anybody wants to print it off, if anyone has bad eyes like me, what's the title of the document?
This is actually it's a different title than it's UNESCO Sexuality Education Guidelines. It
We'll put it
doesn't
in
use it
the
uses
description.
guidelines rather
We
than
can put it in
standards.
the
But we
description
will have the
field.
link in the description. Yeah,
Perfect.
absolutely. So don't worry.
Brilliant.
We'll put the links to the main documents be right up at the
Okay.
top so you can get them straight off. So
Brilliant.
we also have the page numbers here so that you can see the page numbers as we go through it.
Great.
And I guess this isn't, I said there is this issue with the 5 to 8 in terms of some of these themes. Now, the particularly egregious one that'll come up in a little while, we'll see it and we'll highlight it as we go through it. These ones again, there's not that there's anything very bad from a sexuality perspective in any of these. They're kind of generic things, but they're just a little bit too much for a younger person. That's kind of my general thoughts. This is not as bad as the WHO document. So I will make that comment. The WHO document I feel was really overboard in terms of the younger age groups. It really was. I don't think this document is as bad, and it is having to cater for different international situations. So and hence there's more detail in this as well. There's an awful lot more in this document. So I'm going to skip through them quickly. Again, you can see the learning objectives. Some of these things are fine. Whether you need to be covering them off as a dedicated sexuality class or SPHE class for a 5 to 8-year-old, I just don't think you do. That's kind of my general.
I think
But
the
again,
way
we'd be
that a way
interested
that
in
a
people.
child learns
Yeah,
is, you don't force this in through a lesson. The way that a child learns at that 5 to 8 bracket is if there's an issue, you just have a chat straight away. So, if a child was being not nice to another child, maybe not sharing or maybe making fun of them, you just pull them aside, have a quick chat. You don't need a full lesson or a full module or pushing it in their face. You kind of address it as and when in real time with the child in a one-to-one. So I would agree. I think it's a bit much to have as a lesson plan or such.
Yeah. And again, you can see that there's certain themes coming in here, talking about discrimination. There's certainly themes that would be, again, related to other geographies, and which wouldn't be necessarily issues in an Irish context, for example. And we'll see that right throughout the document. So I'll move on quickly because we want to probably get to the more serious ones. This talks about, again, different family structures. Again, I just don't think this is necessary at this age group, and again, if you need, it's up to parents to deal with it if they need to deal with it for a particular child. Um, you can see this thing about forced marriages. So this is an example of, the fact that you're going to have underage forced marriages, for example, forced underage sex, etc. Again, these are not things from you wouldn't see these appearing, and obviously in an Irish context, they wouldn't be brought in. So, that's why you might probably raising your eyebrows as to why some of these things are appearing in the document. But remember, this is a global document. Values, strong beliefs. I think this is, some of this is probably fine. I think a general point I'll make about the UNESCO document compared to the WHO document is that it's an awful lot more open to the fact that the children are coming from different backgrounds. And again, that's due to the global nature of the document. And hence it has more respect for the belief systems that those children may have. And so that's something, it's a positive, right? So that's a positive in this document. It does appreciate that people are coming from different religious, cultural backgrounds, and their attitudes to different things will hence be different. Now, that doesn't mean the document is perfect, but it's something that doesn't really come out in the WHO document at all. The WHO document is kind of assuming we're all the one, we're all in Europe, and we're all in line.
And
That's kind of
The
the
WHO
WHO
one
one.
was very highly sexualized. It was very a lot about the gender ideology, highly sexualized, teaching about, intercourse, orgasm, masturbation at a very, very young age, sexual, activity at a very young age. So that was even worse. But I think the thing that many people may not know if they didn't watch our last two parts is the WHO treaty is due to be ratified across the world in May. So in 5 weeks' time. And the WHO treaty will dictate what all countries do with every aspect: education, food, farming, health, everything. So what we saw in the last one with the WHO standards, if we aren't happy with that, we definitely don't want this treaty coming in telling us how to teach our children.
Yeah. Now, again, we'll get to that a bit more at the end. So I think you can see it there on the right-hand side, identify sources of values and attitudes, um, you know, from your family, etc., your community, much more an appreciation from the fact that people are coming from different backgrounds, will have different belief systems and attitudes toward these things. So I think that's a positive, and respecting that in this document is one of the positive aspects of this document. Um, again, again, it's just too much here for the younger cohorts, getting involved in social media, etc. It's more really, we'll kind of focus maybe on the 9 to 12 years of age. And again, showing culture, religion, etc., and having different, views in terms of sexuality, etc. Again, so some of this is absolutely fine. So I don't have as many issues with this document as the WHO one.
And Eugene,
Okay,
can I just
so
ask, so
yeah.
if I'm the NCCA in Ireland developing the curriculum in the Department of Education, do they take the UNESCO document and the WHO and kind of pick from both, or are they, what do they do with it?
I don't actually know, and I guess they obviously get academics involved to put,
Yeah.
and one of the places they'll draw their information from is those documents, and with reference to those documents. But ultimately, you can see that these are quite high level, right? So they ultimately have to get translated into something that can
Mm-hmm.
be realized in the curriculum and realized in the various textbooks, etc., and teaching materials in the curriculum. And so there's a translation process there, but they should be in line, obviously, because
Mm-hmm.
people can complain and say, well,
Yeah.
I don't like this issue. And, they can go back and say, well, that's in line with the WHO guidelines or standards. It's in line with the UNESCO ones. And the
Mm-hmm.
problem is we have both of them right now. So they can refer to both of them. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's an issue. And again, I'll get to that a little bit later on, because I don't think we should have two standards. I think we should just have one, and we should try to make that one as fit for purpose as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we'll get back to that. So it does feed in, but I think other things do feed in as well, because obviously there's a lot of lobbying from NGOs. There's third party material available. For example, the Amaze videos. I don't know if anybody has seen any of these. If you go on the wellbeing.ie site, you'll have seen these videos that come from a group called Amaze. If you go to amaze.org, you'll see them. Again, they're funded by an NGO, basically. A large American NGO pays for those, and those videos have been used everywhere. And so, very often, if something is available off the shelf, that'll find its way into the curriculum because somebody else has
Mm.
produced it. We don't have to create it. We can just reuse what somebody else has done. And sometimes that mightn't be appropriate. It mightn't be appropriate material. So got to be careful about that. So they're just part, I would say, in answer to your question, Jana, they're part of the mix for creating the curriculum. They obviously serve as a means of justifying what's in the curriculum if there's any query about it. But they're not the full story either. And we will talk in a future video about the broader picture and where some of this other stuff comes from. So again, we'll need to get to that. So I think let's move on here because I do want to get, this is probably one of the slides that's going to trouble people the most, and I just highlighted there.
Oh,
Again, 5 to 8 years
define
of age.
gender and biological sex. So bringing in that
No,
gender.
the title of this slide is the giveaway, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the social construction of gender. So
Mm-hmm.
this is a postmodern construct. So and it's also a queer theory construct, which we talked about in the queer theory video. But this is the language of postmodernism, is the construction, the social construction of gender. It's also the language of Judith Butler, for example, a queer theorist. Um, so this is in the middle of this document, staring you in the face. There it is. Um, Now, what isn't in this document, and this is reflected in the Irish material, SPHE material, and RSE material. What's not in this document is any mention of the term gender dysphoria. It's not in this document, and it's not in the WHO document. You can download them and check them. It doesn't exist in those documents. And there's also no discussion on desistance or any discussion on detransitioning. Those terms are
Mm-hmm.
not mentioned in the documents. And they're not in the Irish school texts either. So you
Mm-hmm.
can see that they are faithful, actually, in this regard, they are faithful to what is in here. So they're just basically
Mm-hmm.
transposing what's in this document and putting it in and putting various diagrams and
Mm-hmm.
other things, pictures and stuff like that around it. So this is the ideological view of gender. It's the postmodern view of gender. It's the queer theory view of gender. It's not the view of Dr. Donal O'Shea of children with gender confusion, which may be caused by a whole manner of other issues. And we did a video about this before
Yes.
Christmas, and
Yes.
we talked about it. So just be very clear. You will not find the word gender dysphoria. You will not find the word desistance or detransition in either of these two documents, and you won't find them in the Irish material either.
So the gender that
They're
kids are being
taking,
taught in schools is it's only putting it in a positive light without talking about some of the extreme risks, the regrets, the desisting, the detransitioning, the health problems, all that other risk that goes with it. We see today, this week, the CAS
yeah,
report. We can go into
gas
that
report.
another time, but it's very one-sided. That's a really good point. Kids are only seeing the one-sided, biased perspective on gender, not the dangerous and regretful side of it.
Yeah, it's the postmodern view that your gender is socially constructed. That's the view. And there's no mention of any sort of pathology, no mention that the child may have other comorbidities, maybe suffering from other depression,
Mm-hmm.
may have been abused, have other reasons for
Mm-hmm.
having confusion over their gender. None of that comes into play. It's the ideology, affirm it,
Mm-hmm.
and go down the, transitioning kind of route. That's the, and now, and we can see obviously the CAS report calls out that
Mm-hmm.
that is not a valid view. Um, and so these documents right now are behind. They're not accurate in terms of reality. They never were, but I think we have an evidence base now that shows them that they absolutely aren't. So this is in here, and it's an integral part of both the WHO and this document. And we'll kind of get to it in the summary as well. So, so you can see it here. That's probably the most egregious section that you're going to find, certainly for the younger cohort, but it applies across the board because you don't want any, this is not being honest about the whole situation of, gender confusion and children having issues with that and the reasons for that. So let's move on. So this is the bad section. So this is not one of the good ones. It talks about gender-based violence. Again, that's probably a bit more applicable to other geographies and other cultures. Not to say that it's not happening in our own culture, but again, I wouldn't be talking about gender-based violence with a 5 to 8 year old.
No.
It's just ridiculous, right? So, or even with the 9 to 12 year old might be a bit much as well. But as I said, I do appreciate that in certain countries there is a need to bring up certain topics earlier, but it wouldn't be in Ireland. I wouldn't have said. So let's scoot on. So we'll move on to the next section. Again, you can follow along where the page numbers are on each of these if you want to follow along. Again, just the stuff that I just wouldn't be getting into some of this. I mean, some of it there is some stuff regarding bullying, etc. And obviously, but I think that can be handled separately, and I don't necessarily need a full curriculum to kind of cover that. So, it's probably not as bad when you get into some of the other areas. There is a discussion on sexual abuse here, etc., on the right hand side, as you kind of see. So, it this isn't as bad. I don't think in general it's as bad as the WHO document, but different parents may have different views, and we'd certainly love to hear some feedback in the comments. If you've been following along through the document here, I'd certainly love to hear some feedback from parents as to what they would be happy with or not happy with. And I think different parents will have different views on certain items, and that's absolutely fine. And we'd certainly love to hear that feedback. It's always good to see it. Again, talking about consent. Now, I just always get kind of worried when I hear a lot of discussion on the topic of consent for younger children in particular, because there is no consent. It's just no. You know what I mean? There isn't a notion of consent for a younger person, obviously. So, and I think we're seeing it in Ireland. We've got this whole consent campaign that's going on at the moment. Again, I don't think for 5 to 8 year olds, it's just a no-no. There's no question of consent here. It's just a no.
And I think on one
Um,
document we reviewed last time, Eugene, maybe it was in the WHO one, it said uh, you don't always have to tell an adult if
yeah,
something feels
I know,
right or
I
doesn't
know,
feel right or something. So it's basically saying
I know. That's
somebody could be being sexually abused. It's saying you don't always, if it feels okay, you don't always have to tell someone. But age 5 to 8, age 9 to 12, there's no consent to your point. It's absolutely no. They're too young to
yeah, yeah,
consent
yeah,
to
yeah.
sexual activity at that age.
Yeah, it's just again, it's probably getting a bit overboard here. They're kind of preempting puberty here. For the 9 to 12, even I know when you get to 9 to 12, you are in a slightly different category, particularly when you get to 11 to 12, for example. So I can appreciate that. But yeah, there is no consent. So it's not a discussion.
There's an
So
interesting point,
let's
Eugene, there. It
yeah,
contradicts what's happening in the world. If you go back one page, explain that during puberty, privacy is about one's body and private space becomes more important. Well, yes,
I
absolutely it
know,
does. That's why there shouldn't be gender neutral toilets.
I
Girls should have
know,
their own
I
private
know.
space. So it's interesting. They
It's
contradict
interesting. Yeah,
themselves.
yeah, yeah. Well done. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's go on. Um, internet, social media, again, you don't want to be exposing your 5 to 8 year olds to any of that anyway. So they shouldn't be there. Again, it's fine. I can accept it for 9 to 12,
Mm.
perhaps. Then this whole media, I mean, you'll see this coming up in the curriculum, the whole kind of media aspect, and children learning about being able to handle themselves online, etc. Um,
And advice from a mother,
yeah,
I
I
would
think when you
say,
get
is
into
I
nine,
know it's hard, but I'll give every parent watching this advice. Keep your children off the tablets, keep them off the video games. The stuff that's on there on TikTok is indoctrinating. They can get even porn on hardcore porn. I've seen myself on Twitter, it's allowed. YouTube, there's stuff out there. So I know it's
yes,
really, really hard, parents. I know it's hard not to throw your kid a tablet, but the stuff on tablets, it's an open gate to pure sexualization and indoctrination. So it's absolutely lethal.
yeah. No, and TikTok is a total no-no. So the first thing to do is get rid of TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm really surprised we haven't banned it. We should be banning it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go on. Talking about peer influence again, like 5 to 8 year olds, just it's crazy. I kind of the right hand side. I'm probably you can debate some of the items on the right, but in general they're not too bad. And again, they do incorporate aspects sometimes that things that may not be applicable to our geography. So again, you'll kind of see that as we go. Um, it's kind of an aspect talking about a little bit about consent and stuff here as well, peer pressure. I think people do feel it at that age, so I can expect that there would be discussions on that. So that's probably fine. Decisions, consequences. Again, it's more focusing on the 9 to 12 because that's really where I think this document is more relevant. Um, I haven't seen anything particularly egregious here. Multiple influences. Again, I think you can see the fact that they are bringing in the different aspects of culture and stuff into it, which is good. That there isn't a one size fits all for all of these things. That people will be coming from different backgrounds, and that will impact their views on things. Communication. That's probably again. I'm looking at focusing really on the 9 to 12 because I think just a lot of the stuff in the 5 to 8 doesn't really cut it. It's nothing particularly bad. These are probably not the worst sections. Let's move on to this, the names, the function of the body parts. So we had this with the WHO one. And you see, part of the problem with this is that these things get translated. The material that comes out that corresponds to these in recent times can be extremely graphic. And that's the problem for the 5 to 8 year olds. It's not just knowing the body parts. You're getting this imagery, which
Mm-hmm.
even for anybody, even for an adult, you wouldn't normally be seeing that kind of imagery in broad daylight. So it's that's the issue. So when you bring this in, you kind of open the door for that kind of exposure for a 5 to 8 year old, which is probably a bit over the top, I would say. So that's kind of the issue. It's less of obviously a little bit less when you get to the 9 to 12. You're getting into you do need to be covering these things. But I do find some of the imagery is just a little, and we will look at some of this. So in the next video, when we look at some of the curriculum material and some of the books, and we'll see those on other little short videos as well.
Mm-hmm.
We will go through some of this with the actual textbooks and show you what we mean, how this can sometimes translate into the curriculum and how it can be a little bit over the top for the younger cohort in particular. Let's move on. Again, again, talk about reproduction, etc. for that young age group. It's just,
And if you have
just too soon,
an
I think.
inquisitive 5-year-old, like my little 5-year-old would ask 100 questions if a topic is brought up, and you say, pregnancy begins when the egg and sperm unite and plant in the uterus. Well, how does the sperm get near the egg? And then you have to start talking about intercourse and sex and all of that. And I think for age 5, it's just a little bit too much too early. Now, of
Yeah.
course, unless they start, maybe asking, but my children are 5 and 8 and they haven't asked, you know, how a baby's made at this point. They're out playing in the mud and growing vegetables and riding their bicycles. They're not asking how babies are made at this point in time.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think there's a so and again, I can understand that when you get to the 9 to 12, it is different, and again, there are cultural differences where perhaps certain things you probably will need to cover off maybe a bit sooner than we would cover them off, in terms of our culture, and that because you need to for that particular environment. So I can appreciate that in a document. These ultimately have to be translated into the local
Mm-hmm.
situation. So we'll move on. Again, a bit of an eye test here. Again, we're talking about puberty, etc. Which in the right hand column is, it's fine in general. You're going to have to be covering that off here, so that's fine. But again, on the right hand side or the left hand side, I should say, the 5 to 12 is just, I just don't think a lot of this we should be covering. Yeah, this is kind of a funny one. Like particularly for the 5 to 8, like this, what's in that 5 to 8 now is kind of like something from the WHO document.
Yeah.
Um,
Enjoy their bodies, be close to others. And it's, I suppose on a standalone, if we hadn't seen all the other material, this wouldn't look
Yeah.
as bad. But because we've seen what they want to teach age, 4 in the WHO document and sex at age 9 and all of that, you think, oh, enjoy their bodies and be close to others. Your mind immediately goes to the other stuff you've seen. So
Yeah.
it could be a
It
bit
is.
premature.
It is. And I mean, if you look at the right-hand side here now, it's not so good on this particular one either. Again, it's getting into this more sex positive view, sexual from births, enjoying sexuality throughout your lifetime type thing. Um, you're kind of getting into that theme that we talked a bit about the last time in the WHO document, unfortunately. So I
And
think for
what
9 to
one thing
12,
that's
I think,
interesting is it talks a
yeah,
lot about sexual things and pleasure and the sexual, like it says on bullet point 2 on the right
yeah,
hand side, describe ways that human beings feel pleasure, kissing, touching, caressing, sexual contact. Nowhere on any of these documents has it talked about these things are meant to happen when you're in a marriage or a committed long-term, relationship of trust. This is all about the sexual pleasure feeling and the consent, but it doesn't talk
yeah,
about in what
I know.
context those feelings should be had.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's that sex positive view,
Mm-hmm.
and so long as you're using protection, so long as there's consent,
Mm-hmm.
you're good to go, kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. So unfortunately, so we'll cover this in the summary because this is a theme between this and the WHO document. So let's move on. I don't think anything else here. Again, it's just this section I'm not comfortable with, to be honest, in this document, and even for the
Age
9 to
five
12
to
category.
eight, people can show love for other people through touching and intimacy. So, age 5 to learn about intimacy and touching. Intimacy shouldn't be for
Yeah, yeah,
age 5 to 8.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so unfortunately, this document in this section, this particular section, is kind of aligning very closely with the WHO one,
And that's a worry as
unfortunately.
well. This goes back, if we just
Yeah,
go back one on the top left.
yeah,
So I've just seen it now. State that people show love, care for other people in different ways, including kissing, hugging, touching, and sexual behaviors. So for a little 5-year-old mind, they might think, I can show love and that I care by sexual behaviors and touching. So if you tell a
yeah,
5-year-old that that's how you show love, they love their mommy, they love their daddy, they
yeah,
love their sister, brother, neighbors, oh, and their play date. So they learn, show
yes,
love through sexual behaviors and touching. That's in their
yeah.
mind.
It is so and this came out when we do the critique at the end. One of the points that was made is it's kind of conflating the relationship, the platonic relationship with a sibling or your
Yeah.
parents or a good friend or something with the sexual type relationship.
Yes.
It's kind of blurring the lines between those, and that's a bad thing in this
That's
document. It's
very
also in the
dangerous to
WHO
tell
document.
age 5 and 8, five to
Yeah,
eight, that you show love through sexual behaviors and touching. Oh goodness, that's
yeah,
that's definitely
yeah,
a worry.
yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
puts in no doubt in our minds the type of person that would have written this book to think that it's okay for kids to show love through sexual behaviors.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, and as I say, these documents come from a particular heritage that we covered off in the in
Hmm.
the last video. So let's move on. So we're into a different section here again, talking about pregnancy again for the it's just for the younger kids. I just think it's just not appropriate. Some things really become quite appropriate again for other cultures where you do have younger marriages taking place, and you've issues with younger people, being in forced marriages and that kind of stuff. So this would be tailored for particular geographies ultimately, to align with that. Let's just move on. So that's kind of the younger age group. It's better than the WHO, but it still has its issues, particularly on the gender and sexuality aspects. I think is kind of the summary. Now let's get into the older age groups. I think in general, it this isn't going to be as bad as we go through it. And again, it has to include things that things like HIV and AIDS, things like that come up here. So this probably isn't as bad. So I think I'm going to go through. If there's anything, shout out. Yeah, and I think in general, I have fewer issues here. Obviously, it inherits what went before it. So when we get into gender and all of
Hmm.
that, it inherits all of that, which is an issue. and it has the whole sex positive ethos
Mhm.
going through it as well, of course. In other areas, then it's probably fine. It's probably okay, and I can understand certain things that are brought in here for, again, for different cultures, etc. So let me skip through this because it's.
And
I think
just
we're
for
going to
our
need to get to
listeners,
the.
Eugene, we can just remind
Yeah,
everyone that this is age 12 to 15. So in Ireland, this would be our junior cycle students in their first year of first, second, and third year of secondary school. And this was the
yeah,
first group, the first cohort of students who had the revised SPHE
yeah,
curriculum, which went into play September 2023, which included the gender ideology. The senior cycle consultation just closed. Those changes will be in place for September 2024. And the primary school consultation is open until the 7th of June. So they're going to be starting to bring in all of this stuff into age 5. But this cohort here, it's already in the schools, the gender ideology and some of the things that we have a big concern with.
yeah, yeah. And I think for the certainly for the primary school curriculum, given what's in these two documents, is a concern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think people should kind of keep that in mind, given that primary school curriculum, it'll be coming in the well-being section of the primary school curriculum. The draft document is up on the NCCA website. People can take a look at it. But I don't think you're going to get an awful lot out of that document. It's not going to go into the detail, even the detail we have here. So there's
We're
it would
we're
be a
really we're
concern there.
really blessed, Eugene, because we have a group of teachers and principals in our network, and we have about 300 teachers in the Irish Education Alliance, and they know what's going into the schools. Even though the NCCA document is vague, we have teachers who have been through the SPHE training, teachers who have seen the material that is not being released to the public. So we'll make sure in our campaign the public is very well versed and clear on what's happening, so they can get that submission in.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on here because I think we do want to get through this one pretty quickly. But there again, this stuff regarding sexual health, etc. on here. I think there is this general ethos is probably the issue in terms of sexuality. That's the ethos becomes more of the issue as you get older. Some of the actual factual content is fine. Relationships, you're getting into this is again because of the age group. It's less of an issue. So I think it's we can probably get through these ones pretty quickly. Having gone through these beforehand, I don't have as many issues in this section.
The
We
age
can
of
see the references
consent
to,
in Ireland is what, 17. So you're already in the 15 to
yeah,
18 section. You're already at that age of sexual consent. And I
yeah,
know the age is 17, but some kids are obviously with TikTok and everything else starting much earlier these days.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think it's less here. We'll see things there. Gender identity again is referred to here. Um, I've less of an issue in general. So I think that we can probably speed through these. Let's look at these other ones: values, attitudes, sexual behaviors. Some of these again, people may not be comfortable with. Um, values that are different from your parents and guardians. I guess that's going to be the case in some cases. Different laws, etc. So there are differences in this. Let's say again, this document is more detailed than the WHO one as a result, because it does have to factor in an awful lot of geographical differences
Mm-hmm.
and things that we might find a little bit shocking in the West. Uh, Social, cultural, religious factors. I mean, this is actually good in one sense, that they say this on the left-hand side there. That they make acknowledge that there will be different views
Mm-hmm.
based on your culture and your beliefs, etc. Yeah, that's fine. Like, they're acknowledging that, which is good. We don't tend to see that elsewhere. Um, let's move on again. So we're into the whole gender area again. So this is the gender area that we saw before, talking about the gender identity and all that. Now it's talking about gender roles and norms, etc. Romantic relationships. Um, Again, like, apart from the broader gender ideology being brought in here and not the full story being brought in,
Mm-hmm.
as I mentioned, some of these other things are probably fine. Let's get into gender stereotypes, equality.
Interesting. On the previous slide, it said something on the right hand
Yeah,
side of the screen about it's important to challenge one's own and other gender biases. So it's in this document saying it's you can challenge your
yeah,
bias, but when it
yeah,
comes to
yeah. So
school, when it's teaching gender ideology that there are 100 genders and this, that, and the other, you're not, students aren't allowed to challenge it. So this is saying it's okay to challenge your own and other biases, but you can't
yeah,
challenge that there
yeah.
are only two sexes. So
So I think, and I'll make the point in the summary. There's a level of social engineering going on here. So it's basically saying that this is the way it is, this is the way gender and everything is now, and you kind of have to put behind maybe your old views of all these things and get with the program, get with the new view, the new postmodern view of gender, because that's the new thing now, that's the way it is.
mhm.
There's a bit of that going on in in both documents, to be honest. So I term it as social engineering. Some people could term it as indoctrination. Um, but that's definitely there. There's definitely a theme there. Again, we're into gender inequality. Uh, you know, some of the stuff is less of an issue. Um, GBV, as I say, gender-based violence. Um, Again, probably less of an issue here, but there are certainly environments that this document would be servicing that would have a real problem with this, and they have to bring that in. Intimate partner violence, you can see it. This, I think it's fine to bring it up, but I suppose this would be brought up in the context of your geography. Um, so let's go on. Sexual abuse, sexual assault. Again, more of this stuff. So I don't have as much of an issue on this stuff. I think a lot of the stuff is fine. Consent. I suppose in the context of the older age group, it's less of an issue. Um, but yeah, again, we'll talk about that in the summary, the general view on that. Bodily integrity, no, there's no issues here. Other things are impacting consent. Some of this stuff is fine. Social media, the internet, cell phones, get a lot of concerns, and as we said, um, but you're into a cohort of kids that are going to have social media, they're going to have phones, they're going to be accessing this stuff,
I
so
think kids these days
you're
get
going to
their
have to cover
phones.
it
I know
off.
I know parents that have given their kids a smartphone, the latest new iPhone at age 10 and 11. I'm thinking, wow, they have an
Yeah,
open door to the entire world of all of the things that we're concerned about at age 10 and 11. But yeah.
you know, yeah, there's nothing, yeah, unfortunately. So let's go through these sexual decisions and behavior. Again, we'll cover some, again, I suppose there's a general kind of sex positive pleasure view in this document. And again, we'll talk about that in the summary. Sexual decision making, social health consequences. Absolutely. It probably doesn't cover the aspect of emotional consequences in terms of sexuality. Again, that's kind of a gap in these documents. It kind of looks at it, so long as you use protection and there's consent, that's it. And it kind of forgets about the emotional aspect and the emotional, damage and pain that can come from that. So they don't really talk about that.
And I don't
Again,
see
we'll
much
cover
on
that.
relationships. I see, even about process of making decisions about sexual
Yeah,
behavior. It doesn't
yeah,
say anywhere
yeah.
that
Not in,
you should be having sex with, when you're at that age of consent with someone that
yeah, yeah,
your
yeah,
lifelong partner, your, what have you.
yeah, yeah. It's not putting it into the context of an actual relationship that you're maybe in at that
Hmm.
time where there's a level of
Hmm.
commitment, etc. That's yeah, that's a general issue. Communication. Again, these are probably fine. I think we'll see all this sort of stuff appear in our curriculum. This sort of stuff, I've seen this in the textbooks, the SPHE textbooks. And a lot of this there isn't really a big issue with it, apart from some of those general themes. So personal needs and sexual limits. Again, this whole consent campaign that's going on at the moment that we've all seen. Next one, again, talking about, and these are again getting into reproduction, etc. at this age group, it's fine.
I see the word chromosomes under the top left. So explain that sex of a
Yeah,
fetus is determined by chromosomes. Well, isn't it funny that on all the textbooks
I
now they're
know.
using the word sex is assigned at birth? And it's like, well, no, it's actually the chromosomes that's determined in the womb.
Yeah, no, it is interesting on this. I noticed that one when I was going through this earlier as well. Yeah, it talks about that in terms of, you know, determining your sex, as it were. But of course, this is in a postmodern context, so that doesn't matter for your gender. So let's move on. So not everyone is fertile. That's fine. That's understandable. So we'll talk about that. And of course, some of the aspects, from a Catholic perspective, people will have seen the most recent thing that's come from the Vatican, which touches on some of the areas in here. And maybe it may warrant a separate video even to discuss some of those things. And I know there's different videos covering different aspects of that, positively and negatively. But it does have very clear messages on things like surrogacy, for example, and gender transition, and obviously people just in terms of their bodily integrity and respect for the person's body, etc. So some of the things in that which obviously would be in contradiction to what is in this document, from a Catholic perspective, Catholic teaching perspective. So I think we're nearing the end of this. Sexual feelings, fantasies, desires, natural. Again, you're into the kind of what I call the Gail Rubin kind of outer circle. Uh, Sometimes you kind of get into that. If you don't know what that means, you can look at the first video we did in this series on queer theory, which talks about, again, sexuality and, expanding the boundaries of sexuality, if I call it that. So that's kind of things that we, again, you would see. And obviously there are cultural dimensions to it. And there has been, again, this goes back to the social engineering aspect, attempting to, I suppose, normalize certain sexual practices which historically people would have frowned upon, and may even have certain health considerations, etc., as well, and which are now being normalized and being brought into the norm and being exposed to kids in school, even as part of the SPHE for the junior cycle. We've seen some stuff there. Again, we might touch on that a little bit before we get to the end of this video. And again, it's kind of talking about this area, and again, I think people, you are talking about an older cohort here, but some of the messaging probably is not what a lot of parents might be comfortable with. But it is an older group. We have to respect that. Transactional sexual activity, which is, again, I guess that's kind of an odd one to see. You kind of say, well, where did that come from? But again, you have to look at the geographic aspect of this. This could be getting taught in the Philippines, for example, or Thailand or whatever, or other countries where this becomes very relevant for young people, young girls in particular, but even young boys, who may be being brought up in poverty, and sex working is an option for them, or they consider that as a potential option. So that's why you see a statement like that. That's where that's kind of coming from. It's coming from a different context. Okay, I think we're going to get towards the end of this section because I think I certainly want to get into the next one. It's important. Health risks. It's kind of an interesting one here in terms of the gaps between births, etc. It's kind of an interesting one to see. I wouldn't have seen that before. It talks about adoption, things that can help threaten a healthy pregnancy. I don't have particular issues with these things. So I think, we're getting into the summary now. In general, this document isn't as bad as the WHO document. It doesn't have the 0 to 4. I think the 5 to 8 is not good. And there's certainly things in the 9 to 12 that wouldn't be great either. And when you get into the older age groups, it becomes more of an issue of ethos and, beliefs, and, the gender stuff. They become more the main issues. And some of the other stuff is kind of generic, and, it's probably not too bad. So let's